Hi guys, the title of the title you see on the screen today. Don't forget to like and subscribe and we'll get started. War. At that time, it was the 520th year of the Empire's calendar. And the war that had lasted for over 7 years between the empires that was Torrentian and Tavorian had reached its peak. And then the third squad of knights engaged in a fierce battle for the return of heir, a strategically important point. A girl named Aness was in the middle of this battle. She was fighting off the enemies herself. But because there were too many of them, she didn't notice them sneaking up on her from behind. And then, when she was about to be shot in the back, she turned around and saw some blonde guy protecting her. Aness took a closer look and recognized him at once. It was Lebanon, her familiar. He was fighting on her side, fighting off all these enemies. The guy came closer to the girl, asking if she was all right. She, wiping the sweat from her face, replied that she was fine thanks to him, and thanked him for that. Lebanon, putting the sword back to its sheath, apologized for saying it in such a situation. They had received a very urgent message, however, and he felt she needed to take a look. The girl, hearing this, was a little surprised, but then inquired what it was about. The man replied that it was the news of her mother's death. Aness, when she heard this information, immediately froze in place. Soon afterwards, she returned from the front and buried her dear mother. In fact, her late mother is hard to catch her not by the grief of war, but by being a good wife and mother. Her father blamed the poor girl for not even being able to be there for her in her last moments. And he told her to leave home if she wasn't going to end up getting married like her mom wanted her to. But shortly thereafter, Inez was proposed to for marriage, which is why she had to accept the proposal from Devon. She was eager to fulfill her dear mother's last will, and Devon needed a wife to raise his 2 children from a previous marriage. Soon the long-awaited day, her wedding day, arrived. Inez rode in the wagon and thought about all the things that would be in store for her in the future. Eventually, they were married. It was a marriage without any feelings for each other, but it didn't seem to matter to the girl. Until she arrived at Pichetter Manor, as soon as the girl stepped off her wagon, she immediately heard the whispering of the maids who stood behind her. One of the maids was wondering why my lord wasn't there, since it was their wedding day. But another said it would be a botched wedding ceremony with just the bride alone. So Devon didn't even show up at his own wedding. Inez spent the entire time in utter shame and discomfort, but she never got to see her husband's face that day. The girl spent her wedding night completely alone, and now 3 days have passed since then. Devon finally showed up. He was smoking his cigar and said he had one great idea for a profitable investment. The man told Inez that he was going to use her dowry for this. When the girl heard this, she was outraged, but she didn't show it on her face. She couldn't believe that 3 whole days after their wedding, which he hadn't even shown up for, that was the first thing he'd said. When he had finished his cigar, he put on his jacket and, starting to leave, said it would be a good idea if she stayed away from high society. Devon also said that she wouldn't have time for that anyway because of babysitting, and after saying that, he looked angrily at the girl he didn't even want in his house. He also said that Inez may be upset now, but in the future she will still understand and accept the situation. In fact, because of her husband who was absent from the manor for days at a time, the servants' attitude had completely changed toward her. As soon as she passed by them, the maids did not hesitate to talk immediately. Some of them were saying that this girl had brought a paltry little money as a dowry. The others kept discussing the fact that the mistress and master slept separately, and they wondered how much of an idiot she must be since my lord had even left the manor after their wedding. Inez had asked her husband for a personal maid, but he resented her and told her to leave it as it was, because he didn't even consider that she was doing anything on the estate, so she certainly didn't need extra servants. But shortly afterward, a maid from her own home came to visit mistress. Inez was very ashamed, for Jessie had worked so hard because of her. But the maid, cleaning her bed for her, said that not at all, because she did the same thing when she lived in her parents' house. So the girl is quite used to such labor. But Jessie was actually very indignant and couldn't believe that not even one maid had been allocated for my lady. Even though Inez was eager to return home, there would still be no joy there for a daughter who had not been by her mother's side in her last moments. And so on days when she could no longer contain her anger, she would sneak out to the training ground and replace all her anger there. And then one night, as she sat gazing up at the huge moon after another workout, the girl finally realized that she didn't like this kind of life. From that moment, Inez was going to take care of the affairs of the family, and the next day she came to her dear husband with this request. When Devon heard that, he was surprised. He was holding the papers he'd been studying in order to accept the new investment. He also said that Viscount Feathers was doing a good job, so he wondered why she would do that. But Inez explained that this is exactly what a mistress of the estate is supposed to do, so she wants to fulfill her duties. In fact, Devon was very hesitant at first, but he quickly came to appreciate her abilities and talent for seeing the flow of money. Pichetra family projects he assigned to the girl always turned out to be a success in the end, and they were backed up by false words of love from her husband. He kept saying that he was proud that she was his wife, but the girl knew the truth, that it was not so at all. One day, as Inez was sitting in the study of the manor house and dealing with papers, Jessie suddenly knocked on her door. The girl said at once that she could come in. As soon as the maid entered the room, the mistress looked up and wondered what was wrong since she had come during working hours. Jessie apologized for being a bother, but she felt that she should intervene, because the man from Ellen's atelier was here. Inez was immediately interested in the case. She got up from the table and wondered where it was. The maid replied that, according to Ramirez, it was the most famous atelier in the capital. They say that one dress there costs as much as a whole estate. When Inez heard this, she was very surprised, for she did not understand why an employee of such an atelier had suddenly come to them. But then suddenly, she heard yelling at the butler from downstairs. One of the girls was saying that it seemed to her that they were not the only ones who had not received their promised money. She said that since the Marquise's family had no way to pay for the dress and jewelry, they had no choice but to seize it. The butler was puzzled. He said that they hadn't really ordered anything from the atelier, so they weren't going to pay anything. Inez immediately thought of the jewels, and when they went downstairs, Jessie, looking around the room, was very surprised and said that my lady was showing that more people had come. The girl decided to intervene after all, and she inquired of the butler what the matter was all about. The man was very surprised to see her, but before he could say a word, she turned to her guests, welcomed them to the manor, and said she would like to offer them tea. She looked at their furious faces and said that the atmosphere was not right for that. The man who had come to them bowed and said that he was Iolo Trisent of the house of the same name, and since payment for his services had not been received on time, he had been forced to come. The girl who made all this fuss said she was Cleo from Ellen's atelier. Inez, when she heard the man's last name, immediately knew that House Trisent was a famous jewelry company that even she had heard of, though she spent almost all her free time on the battlefield. Then she turned to the man and asked if the Marquis had personally ordered all these things. He replied that it was true. He had chosen them personally by visiting their store. The girl immediately said that he had visited them about 3 months ago too, and placed an urgent order, saying it was a dress for his wife. Inez immediately hesitated when she heard all those deadlines, but at that moment the butler slipped her several more checks with simply huge sums. Once she started looking into it, she was very surprised, because these were quite expensive and prestigious stores. Butler said it is a well-known cosmetics workshop in the capital, and they only do business with popular customers who can afford their product. Inez, when she heard this, immediately remembered that 3 months ago her husband had traveled to the capital. Then she asked the employees how often her husband visited the jewelry shop. The man said that he visits them at least once every 2 weeks, and among all the workers he is known to them as a caring husband. The girl thought at once of the dresses she had never received, the jewelry that had been bought with the opportunity, and the cosmetics that are made especially for the upper aristocracy. Of course, she couldn't believe that Devon was buying such lavish gifts just for her, because it made absolutely no sense at all. She was pretty sure those things hadn't been bought for her, because then he would have given them to her long ago. In that case, she suspected that Devon had another woman in his life. In fact, among the aristocrats of Torrent, having lovers was the most common thing to do. But in the 2.5 years of their union, there had never been even a hint of such a mistress on Devon's part. Aness thought about the fact that just as in his previous marriage, he had lived to the end with one woman, and the girl just couldn't believe that a man like Devon could have another woman. She pondered for a while, then turned to the butler and wondered if there was something missing from her appearance. The man felt a little embarrassed by such a question and asked what she even meant. Of course, he had no right to say such things at all. She said that, be that as it may, apparently the Marquis had some mistress, a secret one. But the butler replied that it was not Elle's girl. Aness noticed at that moment that he looked very confused. It wasn't really appropriate to ask the butler, but she realized that too late. She decided not to dwell much on the affair, for she thought there was probably some other reason, and the girl speculated that this might be his plan to restore the status of his kind. In fact, the Pechetra clan, as a member of the Central Council of 12 that discussed important state affairs, was a contented and respected clan with many connections in the capital itself. But that only lasted until the 4th generation. Though the clan failed with the enterprises entrusted to it by the imperial family and was eventually expelled from the Central Council, if Devon could only make his daughter Elizabeth the princess's maid of honor, there would be at least a small chance of returning to the Central Council of 12. If this is indeed Devon's goal, then all the items he bought could have been sent to the palace of the First Empress. In fact, it's not as much money as one might think. It's just that the cosmetic shop in the capital made her wary. The receipt still had a strong scent of perfume on it, but after all, the Emperor had said that he hated the smell of cosmetics very much. She didn't recognize whether the First Empress, who adored her husband so much, would be so smothering. If Devon had bought it, why did he say it was a gift for his wife? The further the girl thought about all of this, the more her thoughts turned to the worst-case scenarios. She realized that she shouldn't worry so much, because Devon would be back in 3 days, and everything would finally clear up. So Aness went to the training ground. She assumed that if she practiced with the sword, her mood would improve. But in the end, when she returned to the manor in the evening, she realized that fatigue on the contrary had made these heavy thoughts even more numerous. She knew perfectly well nights that were like this one, when calm and clear skies flew around her as if everything in the world had stopped. And the night before the decisive battle with Twarian, she had had the same, but that time it was different. Her loyal friends were there to help. Kel, Ter, Beal, and Lebanon were all present. All of them were even willing to give their lives for her. The girl sighed heavily, thinking that it would be very good if everything went without incident this time. And so first thing the next morning, she went to her office to distract her stressed head with work. When the maid came to her, she immediately inquired if there was any news. Ramirez replied that, as usual, she had not gone out with the others to see if Milord had arrived. But the lady signing some papers said she wasn't done with the bills yet, so she had to stay. The maid said it was too much, for the Marquis had promised to return in a week, but it was already the 3rd week since he had left Milady. The girl, hearing this, sighed heavily and told Ramira that she shouldn't speak so recklessly. There might be consequences. And so, at last, after 3 days, the estate returned. It wasn't Devon, though. It was a letter saying that he had decided to extend his journey. The maid was about to say something when she heard a noise outside the window, and looking out, she said that a carriage had just passed along the estate road, and that it must be the Marquis who had returned. Aness immediately gathered herself to go down and meet, for after 3 whole weeks, she would finally be able to see the children. But at that moment, Jessie came running out to meet her. She was very anxious, and turning to my lady, asked if she had not heard from my lord that he would not arrive alone. The girl was a little surprised to hear this, and said that certainly he had mentioned it, but since the guests had arrived, they were bound to meet them. At that moment she went to the window and saw that the children were the first to run out of the carriage. But another thing alarmed her, namely the fact that it was the first time she had ever seen Devon and Elizabeth so happy. And shortly afterward, another man stepped out of the carriage. It was a beautiful young girl. She looked so good, as if she'd stepped out of a painting, and she harmonized perfectly with Devon and his children. The maid was about to say something about that woman, but looking closer, she didn't know who it was. And being indignant, she also said that he would not move away from her as if she were his spouse. The girl turned to her mistress and said that she knew exactly what she was talking about, for it was exactly the same in her family. But at that moment Jessie interrupted her, asking what it was she was even saying. Milady herself, Aness, heard nothing. She was absorbed in her own thoughts. She stood as if a deep dagger had just been thrust into her back. But in that moment, the girl realized that it was as if there had been no place for her in this house from the beginning. Aness never ended up saying hello to her husband that day. After the incident, she did not come down until the next day in the evening to have dinner together. She was insanely annoyed by this disgusting food that had no soul or flavor, but she had to eat it. Then suddenly Devon turned to his wife, saying that last night she didn't even show her father, for he thought she was sick, but now that he sees her, he thinks she's fine. The girl was silent for a while, and then said they had a lot of expenses and she was dealing with the problem, so she couldn't go out and meet him with the kids. The man said he sensed some strange notes in her words, and he felt like there was something behind it, and wondered if she was angry that he had spent so much money. Aness didn't answer anything. In fact, she was just furious, but she couldn't tell him that. When he pulled something from his pocket and placed a small purple box on the table, he told her to open it. The girl looked at him in surprise. After that, she felt a strong, pleasant fragrance that came from that box. She suddenly looked at her spouse and wondered what it was. He, returning to his side of the table, said it was a gift Elizabeth had chosen for her. Looking closely at the package, Aness realized it was from the Firen workshop, and judging by the size, she thought it was a lip balm. She couldn't believe that he really thought he could make her feel better, so she turned to her husband and said that she wasn't a complete idiot after all, and wondered if he really thought she would believe that Elizabeth had bought it. Devon sighed irritably, then wondered if she really needed to get to the bottom of this. He recognized that it was an inexpensive gift, which was why he'd used the baby as an excuse, but he just felt it was necessary to save the estate money. Aness, getting angry, said that if he really wanted to save money, he didn't need to go through his journey like that. For because of him, they had absolutely no money left to get through this winter. The man then couldn't stand it any longer, slapped his hands on the table and started shouting loudly, saying that it was all business investment due to the Pictera with the imperial family. But the girl held firm and said that in order to call it a business, you had to have something to gain from it. But every time he said that, there was no profit in the end. Devon turned around and started to walk away and said that no matter how he said it, she still twisted it differently. So he turned to the butler, requesting that he give his wife the latest news in his place. The butler bowed and said he would be sure to do so. Then the gentleman simply walked out the door, slamming it hard. Aness immediately looked at the worker and wondered what he was talking about. Then the man explained that Miss Elizabeth's birthday was coming up, and it had been decided to have a celebration. The girl was a little surprised and said that of course she wouldn't mind. She thought about what she had seen last night, and couldn't believe that Elizabeth had really been so happy just because of the party. But she, smiling, asked that the butler pour her some more tea, and said that she would surely enjoy it. The man replied that she certainly would. But then, after some time of silence, he said that my lady need not come there. Aness was very surprised to hear this, and afterward asked if he was really telling her now that she didn't have to show up at her own daughter's party. After all that had happened, the girl immediately went to her husband's office and asked if it was really true that it was his own suggestion that Elizabeth's birthday party be spent without her. Devon didn't like it all very much, but he said that of course he told everyone to do that. Then he wondered if there was something wrong with it. Aness was amazed at his determination, but then said it was just outrageous. She didn't understand. Wasn't traveling enough for him. So now he was also telling her to stay away from the party. The man didn't say anything, so she asked him what the reason was for such a rash decision. Devon sighed, and then answered her that this time they had just decided to spend the birthday modestly with her family. When she heard those two words about family, she knew immediately that he didn't consider her a part of them. But the man in turn also added that she kept saying that she was very busy with work, so she probably wouldn't have time. In fact, except for moments when someone really needed her, it had always been just that. Being treated like a complete stranger was quite normal for their family. Aness was silent for a while, and then, dropping her head down, said that she had seen that day the woman with whom he had come. Devon was a little wary but continued to pretend he wasn't really interested in any of this, and wondered what was up with that in general. The girl replied that she had heard that he had placed her in a flicker, and according to the maids, it was particularly unbecoming of some aristocrat. At that moment, she went to the window and looked down into the place where this stranger was just passing. She saw in her manners, which had clearly taken more than a day to study, and a beautiful gait, so she considered that she might be from a more influential family than Pichetra. Aness didn't know for sure what this girl had been brought for. However, she thought that maybe Devon was just going to throw her out and marry this high-status girl to revitalize his beautiful and majestic family. But then suddenly the man shouted at her, asking if she was listening at all, for the girl was so distracted that she hadn't even heard his words. Then Devon decided to repeat them for her, saying that he was talking about how they needed her to strengthen their bond with the imperial family. It was all for their own good. He started to get up from his seat and said he didn't know why she suspected him of anything. The girl asked him if he had no other reason for bringing her to their house. He came closer to her and told her that he was too busy working for his family to have time for such antics, and she knew better than anyone. Seeing her sad face, Devon put his hand on her shoulder and in a more affectionate voice told Aness that he was only hers. But afterward he smiled evilly and wondered if she really thought he could cheat on her. That day the girl went to bed quite early and woke up because of the light that shone directly into her eyes. Aness had been incredibly hot last night, so she decided to go to bed with the window open, and her head was aching somehow. So she sat down on the bed and turned to her maid, Jessie. But looking around, she saw that she was not there, and was very much surprised, for even the room had not been cleaned, though this is usually done by the maid. The girl quickly changed her clothes and went out into the hallway. She started calling for the other maids, and even the butler, but she couldn't find anyone. As she walked by, she stopped suddenly when she heard someone's voices coming from the kitchen. She went in at once. The man who was carrying some boxes in his hands wanted to say something to the others, but when he saw my lady, he stopped talking. Aness stepped inside and apologized for showing up so suddenly, but she just wanted to ask them something. But at that moment, a beautiful girl suddenly ran out to them. She turned to the butler and told him to pay special attention to the food. Although he knows everything without her saying it, she decided to remind him just in case. Well, when the girl turned to the side, she saw Aness, who was still standing nearby, and looked at her in surprise, wondering who she even was. She herself saw the striking appearance and demeanor that was typical of aristocrats. She knew immediately that this was the woman who had been by Devon's side. Aness was wary, not sure what she was even doing here, since she had been told she was only in the outhouse. But she knew she had to calm down, so as not to show her bad side. Well, then making a rather gruff voice, she inquired of the stranger who she even was, for it was the first time she had seen her there. Then the woman, who had incredibly good manners, laughed and said that she must be the child who had arrived at the manor in her absence, and she was about to give her name. But at that moment, the butler stepped forward, and turning to my lady, said that she had somehow awakened early this day. The stranger, when she heard this address, was very much surprised, and the butler in turn, turning to her, said that it was necessary to call if she needed anything, and it was quite unnecessary to go downstairs. Aness explained that she only did it because no one came when she called. In fact, the girl would really like to know why the guest was behaving as if she were the hostess in this house. But of course she could not ask this question in front of everyone, because then she would show that she was very uncultured. The girl came closer and said that she had heard from her husband that they had guests. Then she bowed and said that she was the mistress of the estate, and also gave her name. The stranger, in turn, laughed coquettishly and said she was sorry they had never gotten to meet yesterday, and said her name was Sophia. She explained that Milord had asked her to help with the preparations for the feast, and because of that, she was completely late in greeting the lady of the manor. Aness, when she heard about it, was very surprised. She didn't understand how a guest, who was probably an aristocrat, could be helping with a party for their Elizabeth. She thought the best thing to do would be to just ask Devon about it. So turning around to leave, she said that since it was indeed true, in that case she wanted the girl to do her best, for Elizabeth was really looking forward to this holiday. Sophia made a very surprised look, and then asked the girl if she even wanted to ask why Milord had assigned her to this case. She smiled and said that he had been talking about her having absolutely no interest in housekeeping, and laughing, said that apparently that was indeed true. The girl also said that, seeing her, it seems to her that Aness doesn't really care much about her appearance either. Aness was well aware that it was a blatant provocation, but she held back her angry emotions. She said that it was not something an outsider could interfere in. She too had her own things to do on the estate, so she had no right to judge her. Sophia said that she was a knight before, after all, and her Mariah speech really scares her. Tears even came to her eyes then, and she said that she would make such a mess of it, that they could get along if they shared the same hobbies. Aness realized that this girl wanted to make her look bad by pretending to be so scared. Even though it makes her feel bad, she realizes that she shouldn't go along with this provocation. She then went to the butler and asked him to send Jesse and Ramirez to her. The man said that of course he would do it right away. After that, she simply walked out the door, heading back to her room. Sophia smiled evilly at this point, thinking that she was probably just going to ignore her. But of course, she had her own plan for that. So this wasn't the end of it. Soon the maids returned to their mistress's room and immediately began apologizing to her. Jesse said they went, but not of their own accord. The second maid agreed and said that they had said they could not go, for it was time for the bears to awaken. However, he insisted on their presence. Aness, for her part, smiled and said it was all right. So she asked that they both lift up, for she was grateful that they had a hand in preparing the feast for Elizabeth. When the maids heard this, they looked around in surprise. But then Jesse said that they hadn't really gone to help with the preparations for the young mistress's party. Aness looked at them in surprise and asked, in that case, what was the reason they were not present? The maid lowered her head and said that it was actually because Milord had ordered her to help out with equipment for the guests from the outhouse. The girl said that there were a great many maids on this estate after all, and she did not understand why it was they who were asked. Jesse said he explained that the other maids weren't supposed to and that they were the ones who had to go. Then the other maid said that she had also heard something strange. She thought she recognized the identity of the mysterious woman from the outhouse. She said that there was a girl named Lily who had been working at the manor since she was a child. She overheard a conversation between Lily and a maid who came with the woman. And Lilia herself said that my lady had finally returned to the manor and would now be able to get along. Aness, when she heard this, was very surprised and now realized why Sophia had only given her first name, hiding her last name. This was done on purpose so that she would not guess. Ours was that Sophia Roland was the only daughter of Duke Roland, one of the members of the Central Council of the 12. She was also the ex-wife of Aness's current husband. The girl, having heard this information, sighed heavily and said that it was a rather funny situation. She realized that Devon had lied to her by calling his ex-wife just a guest, but she wondered for what reason. She couldn't believe that he really thought there was no problem with seeing his ex-wife. Suddenly Jesse came to her, asking if she was all right. The girl thought about the fact that even if she tried to find out anything now, Devon would only try harder to hide the information. So in that case, she decided to do things another way and, turning to Jesse, requested that she would get Viscount Percile. Aness was going to play around with the estate's finances a bit and see how they reacted. The Viscount soon arrived at the girl's bedroom and inquired if she really wanted to see him. The girl nodded in response and told him to go ahead. She suggested we meet because she had some important news. From this day forward, she was going to stop running Pichetra's businesses. The girl was not going to sit idly by, she wanted to avenge herself. Viscount Percile, who was the financier of the family, was very much surprised to hear this, and asked if she was really going to stop managing the enterprises. Aness explained that she was going to take a short break and think about some personal matters. The man was simply confused and wondered why she had made such an important decision so suddenly. The girl explained that she had recently hurt the Marquise's feelings, and he didn't like her approach to work anyway, so she didn't think they were losing anything. Her husband always belittled the honors and victories she made to other workers. The Viscount was still very lost, but said that even if she was really going to do it, he wondered how long it would last. Aness said that she thought she should step away from business for at least a week. When the man heard this, he was immediately disappointed, for in that week there was much to do and much to lose. But she in turn said in an indifferent voice that it would be well to entrust matters to the lady of the outhouse for the time she would be absent. The Viscount, when he heard this, was so surprised that he couldn't even say a word. Of course, he knew it was a complete, and that's because this woman can't even understand a ledger. She's used to spending, not earning. Aness, in turn, did not wish to discuss it any further, so she turned around and began to walk away. The girl thought her trap was perfectly set, so a certain reaction should follow quite soon. But she was also alarmed that the Viscount was not the least bit surprised when she told him to entrust matters to the lady of the annex. It was all more as if he already knew who Sophia was. She knew that almost all of the estate's employees had come to this place 3 years ago, just before she'd arrived. All the servants replaced on purpose. There were only a few people left, including the butler, also the head maid, who were long gone. And they recognized Sophia, of course. The fact that none of them had told her, however, just amazed the girl. She couldn't believe that not only Devon, but everyone on the estate was just taking and deceiving her. Immediately after talking to his mistress, Viscount came to Devon and explained the whole situation. But he told the boy to just leave it alone. The man, when he heard this, was very much surprised and asked how he could talk like that, for he informed him that Milady had decided to take a vacation in his affairs. The man sighed, saying that surely she had told him that recently too. Though it is a bit absurd, however, he will deal with it at all. So he just asked that the Vicomte leave the documents in his office, and that's it. The man was very unhappy with this decision. After all, no one but my lady would be able to deal with all this as much as he needed to. In fact, entrepreneurship is definitely not child's play with numbers, and my lord's business abilities are no match for Aness's. But then suddenly Devon was angry, asking the Viscount why he was still standing. Does he think he can't handle the work his wife is doing? The guy was immediately embarrassed, and he said that he wasn't at all. He was just worried about whether the Lord would have too much to do, and whether he would be able to handle them all without being overwhelmed. The guy at this point walked over to a cart with a lot of different papers on it, and said he just needed to look at it and sign it. Then he opened one of the books, and was very surprised. The man flipped through a few pages, then turning to the Viscount, asked what it even was. Thoth in turn explained that this was the profit they had made through my lady's agreement with the county for the supply of magical stones. Devon closed the book and said he could see that perfectly well. However, he doesn't understand why they have a smaller portion of the profits. The man said that it was all because the materials for magic stones were very expensive, and their extraction was quite a costly affair. He also said that if he looked at the other papers, which were just such as he had picked up, he could see that the profit on the part of the supplier was justified. But the gentleman at this point raised his voice and asked that the Viscount tell him to redistribute this profit. When the lad heard this, he was very much surprised and asked what he meant. Devon in turn requested a meeting as soon as possible to discuss the matter and negotiate a profit of at least 10% more. And since that moment some time had passed, the meeting did not end well. When Devon went out the door, he was very indignant. He didn't understand what kind of count he was, and how he dared to act like that, even in front of the Viscount. The man who had been invited asked the Marquis whether he had accurately drawn up the plan of this enterprise, for in that case, why he was quite ignorant of it. Devon was going upstairs, not understanding how he was even going to cancel the contract, since it was a complete disregard for the status of the family. The Vicomte, who was following him, said that, with all due respect, he had nothing against his professionalism. He wondered, however, if it might be better to leave the matter to my lady. The man was very angry when he heard this. The Vicomte said that in fact, the fact that my lady had managed to negotiate a profit on the initial percentage was already a great achievement. Now, however, he was getting it wrong again, so he went back to negotiating. Devon was at his limit. He looked at his employee and asked if he really meant to say that he was worse at these things than Aness. But the Viscount, without concealing the truth, said that it was really so, and he should accept the fact, for it was really true. The master was so angry that he even slammed his hands on the table. When they returned to the office, he said that his employer was himself, and the fellow must do as he commanded. And if he doesn't intend to, he will be gone immediately. But then suddenly someone knocked on their room and asked if they could come in. Devon looked angrily at the door and wondered who else was there, because he was busy to death. The butler came into the room, bowed, apologized, and said that a maid had come in who said that my lady was very unwell and she asked that the family doctor be sent. Devon in turn only frowned and said it was pretty funny, and thought to himself that really all this while straining to him was Aness' fault. All that has happened now is because of her nonsensical statements. The man started shouting at the butler, saying that she wasn't doing anything, and that they didn't realize that he knew she was trying to get his attention. So Devon asked that they all tell her that it was useless and she wouldn't make it. At that moment, Aness finally woke up. She wondered how long she had slept, for she didn't even know what day it was. When she tried to say something, she felt that her voice had even dropped. She thought about calling the maid to bring her something warm to drink. But as soon as the girl pushed back her screen, she heard Jesse talking to Ramirez. Jesse said he really refused to call the doctor. And besides, it looked like the family healer was in the outhouse right now. When the other maid heard this, was very surprised. She asked why it was at the ex-wife's house. Jesse straight up couldn't hold back her tears and said that any way you look at it, that woman apparently really is pregnant. Aness, when she heard this, was very surprised. She could not believe that Sophia could really be pregnant. In fact, she and Devon never slept together once after the wedding. He'd said he didn't want the children of his parents' shaken divorce to have step-siblings. The man who said such things now has an ex-wife who is pregnant, possibly by him. Aness smiled at this point, and realized that indeed, a child by his ex-wife would not be stepchildren to them, and that was downright absurd in her opinion. She thought about the fact that since Sophia had gotten pregnant and returned to the estate with him, there was only one outcome of events, and that was divorce. And even in that situation, her husband had shamelessly lied to her face that Sophia was just a guest. Aness assumed that she must have seemed very funny to them in that situation. She tried her best to believe her husband. After all, they'd been together for so many years, but in the end it turned out to be completely different. Although the girl was very sad, she realized that there was no way she could be kicked out of the estate. This was how she wasn't going to refuse the divorce. However, she wasn't going to be at their mercy either. Jesse in turn became very angry and asked, "What kind of an idiot is this Marquis?" She couldn't believe that he really thought that because he was from a good family, he could do anything. She couldn't understand how he could do that to my lady. At that moment, Aness got out of bed and walked over to the maids. When they saw her, they immediately closed the conversation and rejoiced. Jesse inquired how she was feeling and also asked that the girl drink some water. As soon as she did, Jesse said that she was incredibly sorry to say this at such a time of her illness, but she just had to know it. The girl didn't have time to finish anything, because Aness came close to them and hugged them. The maids were very surprised when they saw this, and the mistress in turn said that they might as well not tell, for she already knew everything, because she had heard what they were talking about. Then she also said in a cold voice that Devon would probably ask for a divorce. Jesse looked at her in surprise and asked if she really thought it would come to that. But Aness said it's the opposite. She's even glad it worked out that way, because it's so much better than continuing to live with someone like that. She was not going to divorce him quietly, however, because she needed to teach him a lesson. She turned to her maids and asked if they would help her do it one last time. At this very time, Sophia was sitting near the mirror, and the maid who was helping her with her hair wondered if it was really planning to use that woman. Ta smiled and asked if she was not allowed to do that. When the maid heard this, it meant shouting, saying that under no circumstances could she do such a thing. The maid explained that the mistress of the manor did nothing but transfer food, and wondered how Sophia was going to use such a person for her own purposes. In fact, Devon kept his word that he gave to Sophia after the divorce. She'd gone to the magic tower, taking 2 promises from him. The first was to in no way sleep with his new wife. The second was for him to make sure that this woman was remembered as incompetent and immoral. And even if Devon seems a little silly at first glance, he absolutely sticks to the plan in these cases. But really, it was really true. Sophia felt that just letting that woman go would be a waste of her powers. So she thought it worthwhile to leave her to work for them forever, sending her off to the outhouse alone. In that case, Sophia would be able to enjoy her life in peace, doing only what she wanted to do. They were silent for a while. Then the mistress said in the maid's voice that she really had nowhere to go because of her quarrel with her father, after all, and she had heard about her troubled past. so they should let her stay at the manor, at least in the annex. The maid, when she heard this, was very surprised and said, looking sadly at Sophia, that her kindness was the real problem. At that moment, someone knocked on their room. It was Gail, the head maid. As soon as she got inside, she said the maid came in, to the woman who says she has something very urgent to say. Sophia was a little surprised to hear this, but allowed herself to be let in. Then indeed, a maid came running in, and crouching down on her knees, she immediately began begging Sophia not to throw it away. Gail, for her part, said that apparently word had gotten to her that the landlady was going to change, and she was afraid of being unwanted. The maid, for her part, did not continue with my lady's request, saying that she was single-handedly caring for her sick mother, and had nowhere else to go. She really needs this job. Sophia at this moment thought about the fact that it was really over. A mistress who couldn't win the trust of even her own maids would lose absolutely everything, so there was no need to fear her competition. So the girl smiled and asked the maid her name. Ramira raised her head up and said her name in a shaky voice. In the evening, when it was over, Ramira returned to Mistress's bedroom and said that she had been so much nervous that now her whole body even ached. Jessia began to massage her and told her that she had done a very good job. The maid looked at her and smiled, thanking her for her kindness. Aness in turn apologized to her for such a request and said she was really embarrassed that the maids had to put up with all this. But Ramira said it wasn't like that at all. She said that her mother had been hurt in a similar situation and still wanted to volunteer to help. So she said that it was better for Madame to get better herself sooner, for my lady's complexion was still not healthy, and she was incredibly worried about it. Aness smiled and thanked her. Then she asked if she could tell me what she had learned. The maid became a little uncomfortable, but she said that she hadn't really spoken much to my lady of the outhouse. But she said that she had done the right thing in approaching her, and had entrusted her with some small thing. It was a bit of a surprise to Ramira. However, she assured herself that she would absolutely not drive Aness away. The girl at this moment thought about the fact that everything was as expected. It was a good decision to send the maid to Sophia. That way, she would definitely be able to find out their intention. Viscount Purcell didn't wait out Sophia's management of the enterprises, and Devon botched the deal the girl had been working on all along. As a result, they had no thought of chasing away the one who annoyed them the most, namely, Aness. The reason was very simple. They want to keep the girl on the estate, to make her work for them for the rest of her life. She was just supposed to be their puppet, that's all. The girl's a little sad. I don't know what she should do now. After all, if nothing is done, she could really be trapped in this manor forever. Aness will have a very hard time escaping. But unless someone puts a sword in her hands, she will take action immediately. But what stopped her from running away was Jessie, Ramirez, and their families. She didn't know what would happen to them in the end. Aness turned to the maid and said she would write a note for Devon, and wondered if she could give it to him. And afterward, she asked that Jessie bring the sphere of communication she had brought with her to this estate. The maids immediately performed their duties, and Aness began to open the box in which the orb lay. In fact, this is the first time she's opened it in years. It's a sphere her older sister left her for emergency communications. Sister had entered the ducal family at a young age and was still single-handedly waging her own struggle there. Aness certainly doesn't want to make her worry about her as well. So as much as possible, she solved all the problems herself and didn't use this means of communication. However, to invite one person to the manor who can help her, no matter how pitiful the girl feels. She would have to ask her sister for help after all. All because if she calls him out in person, there's a chance Devon and Sophia will start spreading weird rumors about her. But at that moment, Devon suddenly came into her room, without even knocking, and asked his wife what she was even doing and what that note was. He didn't understand how she could talk about having something to say to Sophia. Aness, in turn, closed the box quickly so he wouldn't see, and said she'd heard that his ex-wife was pregnant. The man was a little wary and was silent for a while. Then he said that she reacted much more calmly than he had expected. The girl in turn explained that it was because it wasn't the first time he had made her wonder. And yet she wondered if he didn't owe her an explanation. Devon was very embarrassed at this point, and he laughed and said that the pregnancy was a total accident. They'd seen each other a few times to discuss Elizabeth's holiday, but he'd had a lot to drink, and that was just the way it had worked out. Aness silently watched what he was saying. but she didn't understand if he really thought that was a normal excuse. And even if he called the pregnancy an accident, how could she accept it, even after such a blatant lie? Then the girl said that anyway, since it was his child, who should she take care of him and raise him with the other children? But the man started pulling something out of his pocket and said that this was definitely not the way to do it. Then he pointed to a piece of paper and said he wanted her to divorce with him for a while. Devon said that she knows, doesn't she, that it's very important for the imperial family's maid of honor that both parents have titles of vicegrad. Besides, he doesn't want the child to be born out of wedlock. So when Elizabeth becomes maid of honor and the baby is born, he plans to marry her again. He said lastly that he would only have to be patient for a few years. Aness smiled and sighed heavily when she heard that. In fact, it was exactly as she had expected. Then she wondered in a calm voice if he was really going to end up divorcing her and remarrying Sophia. The man came closer to her and took her hand and told her that it was nothing more than a fake divorce and marriage, and even if they divorced, he would still continue to be her husband. Aness was disgusted that he, with the hands that touched that woman Sophia, held her hand and in the voice with which he whispered tender words to her, called himself her husband. The man smiled and also said that she would only move and live in the outhouse. Otherwise nothing would change. Aness was very angry with him and thought that this man was really selfish. In turn said that she would simply have to manage the businesses as before, but she would do so in an outhouse rather than on the estate. The girl just couldn't believe that she had fallen for the ploy of such a predictable man in the past. She pulled her hand out and asked him if he was sure he wouldn't regret this decision. Devon smiled and looked away from her and said he was trying so hard now, just so he wouldn't regret it in the future. Aness began to move away from him and said that she now understood everything, and she also added that as soon as Viscount Purcell and the butler arrived, she would sign the divorce papers, and they would act as witnesses in such a case. The man was a little surprised at her conditions. However, he thanked her for her understanding and said that she would definitely not regret it. Aness smiled goodbye to him too, and said that she really hoped he wouldn't regret this decision in the future. The next day, Devon was going to visit his wife and sign the divorce papers. He went to the butler and asked if he had everything ready. The man bowed and said that was right. He had sent a man to the temple for them. Then the guy, with a smile on his face and an unimaginably good mood in his soul, said that all they had to do was wait for confirmation from them, and that was just a formality. He then asked if Aness's things had been moved to the outhouse. The butler said they had, and he asked him to get the maids to tidy up. But then suddenly the butler interrupted him and told my lord that it was still early in the morning that a message had arrived of an imminent visitor. This person is Lady Selene Stecker. When Devon heard this, he immediately froze in place. He looked at the butler and wondered if it was really the Lady of Stecker Duchy. An employee of the house confirmed this information. In fact, the Stecker family is quite a noble family with a long history who are members of the Central Council of 12. And now the man did not understand why the only lady of this duchy should visit their estate. He was very worried, but he asked the butler to have everything ready for her right away. He thought that whatever the purpose of her visit, it would still be a good chance for his kind to run for the Central Council again. By then, this girl with bright red hair had already arrived at their estate.